Hi there, my name is Neil Blevins, and I'm an art director and concept artist in the entertainment field, and this video is called Art Process Overview. So whether you're doing concept art, illustration, video games, animated films, or visual effects, we're all basically doing the same thing, trying to create compelling imagery. So in this tutorial, I'm going to show you my own personal art workflow, which I've refined over the years into 22 distinct stages. So here's a chart of these stages. So the first section is pre-pro, and that involves an initial section, which is ideas and pillars, then research and reference, and then text and keywords. Then there's a foundation images category, which is type and symbols, shaders, color design, shapes and patterns, details and test scenes, and composition. Then there's a sketch category, which is silhouette sketches, line sketches, 3D sketches and cameras, color sketches, and photo sketches. Then we move into the rough area, and that includes a prep, which is compositing and actually making the rough. Then there's a finals area, and that includes photos, and that's the photo bashing process. Then a 3D category, which includes lighting and rendering, modeling, sculpting, and model assembly, and then surfacing. And then a painting section, which is the final painting. And finally, there's post, which is where we do all our tweaks. So no matter what job you do, you're basically doing some subset of these stages. So some examples. If you're a concept artist or matte painter who likes incorporating 3D into your workflow, you might do all 22 stages. Or if you're a more traditional 2D concept artist, you might skip stages 17 to 20 and focus mostly on stage 21. Or if you're a concept artist but like keeping your paintings rough, you may do stages 1 to 16 and 22 only. Or if you're a modeler in feature animation, you might only do stage 19. Or if you're a shader texture artist in visual effects, you may only do stage 20. So a few other notes before moving on. First, I frequently skip a stage or two if they're not needed for a project. Like you'll notice I outlined 5 different types of sketches, but I've never actually made all 5 sketches for a single project. I usually only do 1 or 2 before moving on to the rough painting. And then also, the reason these are called stages and not steps is because it's not unusual to do the stages out of order. Like you might do a color sketch, which is number 13, then realize you need to work more on the silhouette, and so you jump back to stage 10 to do some more exploration. So these stages are here to help and can be done in any order, and some can be skipped. They're not here to define a rigid workflow. They're here to help you succeed. So now let's get into some more detail about each stage. As a practical example, I'll be using the creation process for my seastead image from my megastructure series. So let's start with the initial stages, which are about the ideas and gathering reference. So number 1 is ideas and pillars. This is the initial idea and then the most important aspects of that idea, also known as visual design pillars. This can be anything from I'm going to make a robot to something more specific, like I'm going to make a robot whose purpose is construction and he'll have really thick arms. In the case of our seastead example, it's I want to illustrate a seastead, a city that floats on water. I also have a general idea of the visual I want, some buildings in the water at either dusk or dawn, sun glints on the windows, and some low cloud cover. Next is getting good reference based on your idea. This can be other artists' work, photos of real things, photos of completely unrelated things that might help support your initial idea, a photo of a material you want to use in the image, even scientific papers. This is one of the most important stages, and one of the stages people most often skip from my experience. Doing this also helps develop your mental visual library, which is all the imagery you've seen in your lifetime. Seeing as many images as possible and filing them away in your brain will always be helpful in the future. Maybe that piece of reference is imperfect for this project, but is perfect for the next. Also good is having a physical library, whether it's books or a digital library of photos, art, and things you grabbed from the web. For example, my digital library is about 1 terabyte and over 1 million images. So for the seastead, I collected photos of cities, buildings, cities popping out of the clouds, oil rigs, and stuff like that. Next is writing down keywords that define your visuals, and writing down a more complex description of the concept, like writing a little backstory for a character or scenario. For the seastead, keywords could be things like mist or shiny tower. And take a moment if you'd like to read a detailed description of the seastead based on my research. So the next category is foundation images. Now these are not sketches of your final painting, they're support images that help define details you will use in that final painting. So we'll start with type and symbols. So will you need typography for this image? Like a company logo on the side of a vehicle maybe? This could be a logo, which is a word or a set of words. It could be a symbol, which would be a picture, or something known as a combination mark, which is a combination of a logo and a symbol. Or do you need text sitting on the image itself, like in a movie poster? Do you want to design your own typeface for the type, or use a pre-existing font? and what typeface will work best for the story you're trying to tell. So for the seastead, since there would be commercial skyscrapers, it made sense to have a couple of logos and symbols that I could slap on them to give the city more life. Shader exploration can be photos of real materials, paintings of materials, or shaders in a 3D program, all to show what materials may be used in the final work, and what those materials might look like. Skin, painted metal, starship hull plating, bark, leaves, all that kind of stuff. For the seastead, here's an example of a skyscraper window material that I made in 3ds Max. So next is color design. What'll be the main color scheme for your piece? Are there secondary colors you can add to make your piece more color rich? And how do the colors support the idea? For the seastead, I picked some colors off the reference photos I had to arrive at my initial color scheme. Next is shapes and patterns. So what will be the general shape language of the objects in your image? All circles, all triangles, straight edges, swooping curves? If you're painting an aggressive robot, will spiky shapes convey that idea better than rounded, curvy shapes? Or for example, the dwarves in the Lord of the Rings films had the gem shape as their main shape language, so in their armor, their weapons, their architecture, you constantly saw that shape. Once you've decided on a shape theme, draw down some shapes that fit that bill, then make sure your design is made up of variations of these shapes. Will you combine shapes into a repeating pattern, like stripes on an animal, panels on a starcraft? Another good example would be, say you're doing ancient Greece. If you check out Greek architecture, you'll constantly see the same 2D patterns again and again, such as something called the meander. So collect these sorts of shapes and patterns for use in your final work. For the seastead, I knew I was going to make a city, so the question is, what sort of city did I want? Because that choice will influence the shape language. If you've ever seen the film Tomorrowland, that city is an idealized 1960s version of a city. It's meant to be playful, and so you have lots of spirals, loops, spheres, and other curvy shapes. Whereas most modern cities are far more about the rectangle, which is the shape of the skyscraper, and the grid, which is the windows. Since other illustrations in the megastructure set would be more curvy and fanciful, I decided to go with a near-future looking city for this one. So the most basic shape would be the tried and true rectangle, the grid, and the triangular wedge. But since it had to look at least a little futuristic, I made more complex and sci-fi patterns for the building details. Now we have details in test scenes. So do you need to do any test images to try out new techniques or new software? Are there specific details in the reference or that you want to build separately to see what they look like before incorporating them into the final image? For the seastead, I considered doing some 3D clouds, but decided to hand paint them instead to get more control. But if I had done the 3D clouds, I might have gotten a copy of Fume Effects for 3ds Max and done some test images to see if I could get the cloud look that I wanted. For example, like this test cloud. Now it's time to do some strong thinking on the composition of the image. What format will the image take? Will the canvas be long and thin like a film frame, or square because I'm making a CD cover? Will the overall composition be circular, triangular? Do I want to use the golden spiral? How much detail does a piece need, and where will it be placed? Since the seastead was for a book, I had the basic page dimension, and I chose the aspect ratio to fit the book. Then since it was going to be a city tends to have pyramid-type shapes. Smaller buildings are on the outskirts, and taller buildings until you reach the city core. So if you ignore the individual buildings and look at them as a single mass, you get a triangle shape. So I decided to place the triangle slightly off-center to avoid it being too perfect. Now it's time to make very simple versions of what your final image will look like. So we're going to start with the silhouette sketch, also sometimes known as a shape sketch. So the idea with the silhouette sketch is to focus on the edges of your object, general proportions, and don't worry too much about the detail. Make sure your subject is instantly recognizable, even if all you see is the silhouette. So for the seastead, I focused on creating a set of buildings that gave that pyramid feel while still being separate buildings. And I tried to decide the proper ratio between the light background, the dark buildings, and the water. So next is the line sketch, also sometimes known as a quick sketch, line drawing, initial sketch, or diagram. So this is a line drawing of your piece. You can use pencil, pen, digital, or whatever. But you're starting to explore the form from your silhouette sketch a little further, including adding some simple details. For the seastead, I tried a little experiment and tried leaning the mass of buildings to the right instead of to the left. It looked okay, but I decided to keep my original idea of the buildings being more on the left. So next is the 3D sketch. So to explore camera and perspective, it may be a good idea to put together some simple shapes in a 3D program like Blender, 3ds Max, Maya, or SketchUp. The 3D process may also suggest camera angles that you wouldn't have thought of if you were only in 2D. Also, the final 3D sketch may be useful to paint over later. You could also choose to make a quick traditional 3D scene or model a character in clay and then take a few pictures. This is something that artist James Gurney does a lot of. For the seastead, I matched the silhouette sketch as closely as I could in 3D. I played with a lot of different lenses to see if a wide angle or a telephoto would be better. And I ended up going with a more telephoto lens, which would be the kind of lens a real person in the water would probably use in a real location. I also played with the camera being from the vantage point of the water or flying high above the water, and in the end I decided to keep the camera closer to the water ground plane, so I'm looking up at the buildings, which gives the buildings a more heroic feel. In this case, since I'd already done a few sketches, my job was to first match the earlier sketch in 3D, and then sweeten it by playing with the camera. But if you start with a 3D sketch before doing any of the other sketches, you can use the stage to explore your set and come up with a number of radically different compositions quickly. You're likely to find some compositions you may not have thought of by wandering around the simple 3D set. So next is the color sketch, also sometimes known as a color brief, color rough, value sketch, color preliminary, color thumbnail, or a flat color sketch. So it's a quick painting to help place your colors. So don't add details, this is all about general color placement, and use your color scheme sketch as a guide, or maybe you'll discover some other colors are better. For the seastead, I colorized my 3D sketch using colors from my color scheme and looking at my reference images. Desaturated orange for the sunlit sides and blue for the shadows in the water. So next is the photo sketch, also sometimes known as a photo bashing sketch or a photo collage. So to avoid that blank canvas effect, you can throw together a sketch using photos of real things as a basis to paint over. I find if I grab a bunch of photos and throw them together in this way, it gives me a start, and it fills the canvas with something, and that gets you moving forward more easily. For the seastead, I went into my reference images and I used a bunch of photos of the San Francisco Bay for the water. And then I found a photo I'd taken in downtown Seattle that had this nice sunset-colored buildings and found some appropriately colored clouds. This sketch allowed me to get a better understanding of the density of the windows on the buildings and the overall color of the lighting. And don't worry about stuff like scale or perspective. That's something that you're going to work on later. So now it's time to go to the next category and make a rough painting of your final image. One step beyond a sketch and one step back from a detailed final painting. So let's start with compositing, also sometimes known as an initial digital collage or image assembly. So first I set up a simple composite for my image in Photoshop, which can be made up of elements from any of the sketches. In visual effects, compositing is usually the last part of the process. But for this sort of work, I usually do it first. Basically, you take the simple elements you have, set up a rough comp, and then go about replacing all those elements with more detailed final work. Think of it kind of like a checklist. I get all the pieces together, and now I have to refine each one separate. The reason the stage can be referred to as a digital collage is because you in fact use multiple elements, hand-painted things, photos, 3D, all mixed together to arrive at your final result. In fact, while most people refer to this sort of work as a painting, I personally prefer the term digital collage, since I think it gives a better idea of what you're actually doing to create the final imagery. For the seastead, I set up my basic comp with groups. So my lowest group is my sky and background clouds, then a water group, then the city groups, and then more clouds. I also plan on doing my final compositing in Red Giant's Magic Bullet Look software, which I use to add glows, vignettes, and final color correction. So I set up a basic comp in that software as well. So now it's time for the rough, also known as a rough digital collage or a rough painting. So in the composite, I start a rough painting to flesh out the details from my sketches. This may be the last step if I don't want to do a more finished image. Also, what constitutes a rough painting is a little subjective. In my case, I classify any painting where I can easily see brushstrokes as a rough painting. For the seastead, since I know I would be doing a more detailed painting, I kept my rough a little rougher than I would have if I knew this was going to be the final product. But an image like this can be a great planning tool for your final painting. Or if, say, I was working on an animated feature and I was doing a lighting key for a shot, this would be enough information to pass on to the lighting department. Getting all the smaller details in there really wouldn't be necessary. Now it's time to combine photos, 3D, and hand painting to arrive at the final image. So we'll start with photo bashing. If I'm going to do a more finished piece, I use bits of photographs to speed up that process. For the seastead, I use several photos to make the water, some for the clouds, and some for the buildings. Here's a bunch of photos I layered in of an oil refinery to make up the smaller buildings near the shore. Many of these buildings would be covered up with clouds, so I didn't worry too much if they were in the right perspective. They're just there to add some building details behind the cloud layer. Now let's move into 3D, and we're going to start with lighting and rendering. So I take my 3D sketch and refine the lighting in 3D, using my rough and my color sketch as a guide. For the seastead, the base lighting is actually very simple. It's a directional light for the sun and a dome light for the sky. I then do my final modeling in 3D. Any part of my scene that will be 3D, I replace the rough 2D layers in my composite with the 3D elements. Modeling generally refers to hard surface modeling. Sculpting generally refers to organic sculpting, maybe using a sculpting program like Mudbox or ZBrush. And model assembly generally means taking the individual modeled and sculpted pieces and sticking them together into a pleasing final model, like for example taking hundreds of plants and putting them on a terrain. While the main hero buildings in the seastead were going to be hand-painted, I needed some background sci-fi buildings, and so used a number of building models from Vitaly Bulgarov from his megastructure Kit Bash pack. Now we have surfacing, sometimes also called shading or texturing. Now I add the final shading and textures to my 3D model. This may be simple, as it might be painting on top of my final image in 2D, or it could be complex if I plan on keeping it mostly in 3D. For the seastead, it was really simple to take buildings and apply a window texture to them in 3D, and this is way more time-consuming to do in 2D after the fact. Now we have the final painting, also known as the final digital collage. So I then take my composite, add the 3D elements that I modeled, lit, and shaded, mixed with any photo elements, and then paint on top in 2D. This painting is far more refined than the rough one, but I use the rough as a guide, and some elements from the rough may even make its way into the final painting. I use lots of modern matte painting techniques to meld the 3D photos and traditional 2D paint together. The idea is some things are just way easier to paint in 2D than in 3D, and some things are easier to photograph and manipulate than to build, and so why not use the best of all worlds? Here showing the elements used for the main building in the seastead. I used photos of real towers on top of the buildings, then added my 3D render of the windows. Then I hand-painted a portion of the building in Photoshop, and the windows on the 3D render basically gave me a perspective grid to paint the other elements. Then all three techniques were layered together to give me the final building. So you think you're done? Let's do one last check. So now it's time for the final tweaks of all the elements. Really push the composition, color, form, and texture. Put the image away for a few days to see it with fresh eyes. Mirror the canvas to see if you've missed something. Compare it to your own work or the work of others to make sure it holds up. And ask someone for their opinion. Look at the image at a different computer or platform to see what small tweaks need to be made. For example, I like looking at it on my iPhone to see it in a very different way. And there you go. Here's the final seastead image. So now I have a little more information on the 22 stages I use for my image making process. Obviously, this is just a short overview of the process. Each stage could easily warrant a full book on the subject. Since books take a lot of time to write and aren't easily updated, I've added tutorials, both video and text, to each of these 22 stages on my website in the art making process section. And I'll add more as time permits. That way, I can share the information as I have time to write and record it, rather than waiting for an entire stage to be fully fleshed out. So if you're interested in following along with all 22 stages, you can read all the articles. Or if you're more of a specialist, say a texture artist, then you can read just the tutorials in the shading and texturing stage. I tried to make the materials on the education page as useful as possible to the widest possible audience, from specialists to generalists, concept artists, matte painters, modelers, shading and texturing artists, and whether you're doing VFX, animated films, or video games, or something else entirely. I've also tried to write as many of the tutorials as possible that don't require knowledge of any specific software. So there you go. Please go explore my education page. I hope you find something in there that'll be useful for your own work.